everybody. I feel like we might get a few more people filtering in at the start of this. We're good and early on a Saturday morning. Michelle is beckoning you forward. I did this yesterday as well. It's like we've got this beautiful, nearly empty front row. But yeah, we'll pull them in, Michelle. Hi.
Hello.
Good morning. Michelle, can we just check the sound is okay with Michelle's mic, please?
Can you hear me okay? Are we turned on? Bonjour.
Pull it in a bit closer. It's good, c'est bon?
Okay.
Right. So official, I have to do the official bit first of all, because we have to do this for everything. We have to thank the money people. Bon matin and good morning, everyone. I'm Rachel McCrum. I am delighted to be here this morning hosting an encounter with Michelle Good, whatever that will be. This activity is co-presented by Kwahiatonhk and the Maison de la littérature as part of the 14th edition of the Salon du livre de Premières Nations. The 2025 edition is brought to you by Hydro-Québec in collaboration with Desjardins, Innergex Renewable Energy, OKT Law and WKND 91.9 FM. Produced by Kwahiatonhk, this year's event is made possible thanks to the financial support of the Canada Council for the Arts, the Government of Canada, the Government of Québec, the SODEC, the City of Québec, the Nations internationale, la Francophonie and Wendake. We have to do that every time.
Of course.
We do. I'm going to read your bio just to set the scene if anybody is unfamiliar with Michelle's work. I suspect you are familiar. The eyes are keen this morning and I see some nodding, so we're going to get into it. Just to say, we'll be here for about 45 minutes. We're going to have a chat. Hopefully we're going to have time for a couple of questions at the end, so if you have come with something to ask, keep that in mind as we go along. Michelle Good is a Cree writer and member of the Red Pheasant Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. After working for Indigenous organizations for 25 years, she obtained a law degree and advocated for residential school survivors for over 14 years. Good earned a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing at the University of British Columbia while still practicing law and managing her own law firm. Her poems, short stories and essays have been published in magazines and anthologies across Canada. Five Little Indians, her first novel in 2020, won many prizes, among them, and I am going to list them, HarperCollins UBC Best New Fiction Prize, the Amazon First Novel Award, the Governor-General's Literary Award, and Canada Reads 2022. She has 2 honorary doctorates. 2. I know the bio was not up to date, from Simon Fraser University and University of Fraser Valley, that's right. Her new work, Truth-Telling, 7 Conversations About Indigenous Life in Canada, published in 2023, won the High Plains International Book Awards 2024 Indigenous Writer category, and in 2025, she won an Inspires Award Arts category. Michelle lives and writes in South Central British Columbia. Please warm your hands and welcome Michelle Good.
Okay.
I'm excited to get into truth-telling with you. We'll circle back to Five Little Indians,
but this truth-telling.
Yeah. The whole world should get into truth-telling, yes. But to set the scene for those who haven't read it, and we are going to check the mics, okay, I'm going to ask you just to read the introduction to tell us what it's about.
Sure. Thank you for joining me this morning. I always like to start by saying that I truly appreciate these opportunities to have these conversations, because truly this is where reconciliation happens, is in the conversations, the dialogue, and the desire to understand each other. So I'll read you this little introduction to truth-telling. It's called Sit With Me. Oops. It's called Sit With Me by this dialogue fire. At the watershed moment in Canadian history, when the Truth and Reconciliation Report was issued, the Honourable Justice Murray Sinclair positioned truth as mandatory and a precedent for reconciliation, articulating the fundamental principle that without truth there can be no reconciliation. This phrase has become like an anthem in the raised voices of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people alike. Oopsie. The urgent demand for truth has become a call to action in itself. The problem with anthems, though, is they tend to become rote, like an absent-minded genuflection, a premeditated land acknowledgement, reduced to the sounds of the words without mindful consideration or intention to follow through. These public gestures are simply a tipping of the hat without any commitment towards substantive recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples to implement jurisdiction in our territories. Truth is more than fact. In Canada, truth must be unearthed from beneath the myth of Canadian history. That history must be understood in a deeply contextual way if we are to move beyond positional and confrontational relationships and into functional ones dedicated to substantive change. We must step away from the window dressing of reconciliation. We must come to a place of understanding that the colonial history of Canada was genocidal in nature, functioning as an imperative embedded in the very heart of colonialism. The conversations, academic and otherwise, about colonialism articulate its complexity, and we see work in its derivatives, post-colonialism, neo-colonialism, settler colonialism, and so on. Each of these iterations and more generate important and elucidative study. At the same time, I find it distracts from the fundamental meaning of colonialism, and it is crucial that its ugly heart not be lost in the study of it. Colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. That's it, that's all. This is the unvarnished, grasping truth of the intention of colonizing European nations that set their sights on the riches of the so-called New World. Human settlement was only secondary to the economic goal, the colonizing settlers simply the drones in the beehive of colonial ventures. Their value limited to how well they enrich the various states who financed the colonial venture. I often visualize what I refer to as the colonial toolkit, a collection of implements used to activate the aims of colonialism. All the implements in the toolkit were and are employed to remove us from our lands, disempower us in decisions about our lands and resources, dismantle our highly effective social institutions, and dismember our families and communities. To accomplish these colonial goals, there were, for example, policies that established the mandated starvation of Indigenous peoples to force their submission, to dismantle traditional family structures, social institutions, and community systems. We saw policy and law mandating the wholesale removal of children for placement in residential schools for the sole purpose of deconstructing them and reconstructing them in the image of white men. To understand the brutal circumstances Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island continue to endure, we must reach under the myth of Canadian history. We must embrace history in the way Indigenous peoples experienced it as it truly unfolded. Only then will non-Indigenous Canadians begin to grasp the true horror of what we were subjected to and how the seeds of that horror continue to sprout and take hold in our lives today. It's also important to understand that history does not only refer to events lost to the mists of time. History is also contemporary. Contextually, the history of relations between Indigenous people and those who settled here must be understood in the context of first contact, but also in times as recent as last year. The history of Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations is on a continuum from the beginning to now and must be understood that way if non-Indigenous Canadians are ever to grasp what the prerequisites to substantive reconciliation in fact are. To participate meaningfully in reconciliation, non-Indigenous Canadians must not only be supportive, but must also insist that the resources, natural, political, and financial, required for substantive change are generously and enthusiastically provided. Non-Indigenous Canadians must use their privilege to leverage real change. It is simply not enough to wear an orange shirt or issue empty land acknowledgements. The non-Indigenous population of this country must not only talk, they must also act. These are not academic essays, neither are they exhaustive. They are my personal take on this new world brought to us by colonialism, a world in which we still struggle to survive. These essays examine the brutal intentions of colonialism that continue to harm us, whether that be in the form of starvation policies, residential schools and their child welfare descendants, the acceptance of brutality against our women, the dishonesty of government, or the insufficiency of monetary compensation as a concept. I encourage readers to start with the first essay as it provides an historical foundation that informs the subsequent essays. I also encourage readers to consider Indigenous reality in the true context of these histories, to deepen their understanding and call upon their own compassion and responsibility to engage in these conversations beyond the last page. During momentous occasions, many Indigenous people engage in the ceremonial practice of lighting a spirit fire to engage the ancestors, so to speak. The fire remains burning day and night until the occasion is complete. These essays are intended to spark dialogue, to provide a deeper view of both early and contemporary history through the lens of Indigenous experience. Let us, together, light a dialogue fire. Let us keep the flame alive until truth overturns the colonial lie.
Does it make you want to read the book? Good. Good. It's available next door. One of the things that struck me about the intro was the language of it. It's time. We must. Canada must. It's uncompromising, and it feels there's an urgency to it. 10 years down the line from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, what was your urgency for this? Where did it come from?
Well, I mean, the book came out before it was 10 years, but it is now 10 years. 2015, the report came out with the 94 calls to action, which were so brilliantly, carefully, created and presented. To date, 14 of those calls to action have been implemented, only 14 out of 94. And what I find and that's just not good enough, but what I find very interesting about that, and you can do this analysis yourself, is that the calls to action that have been implemented are the ones that require little more than the stroke of a pen. Okay, the provision of additional funding to the Canada Council for the support of Indigenous arts, the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. It's not to say that these are not important. Some of them are critically important, but they're ones that just require the stroke of a pen and the provision of financial resources to make it possible. And, so when you look at that, you think, well, why? Why is it that it's those ones? And it's because the rest of the calls to action, the ones, for example, that require fundamental change to the justice system, require a substantive structural change in the way Canada operates, in the way Canada functions as a government, as a bureaucracy, as institution, through legislation. And that requires a much deeper deconstruction and then reconstruction. And it's something that I question the capacity of a colonially founded government to, pull the thread of that colonial structure and recreate something else in its place. So, but we don't give up. We must continue to have hope, because without hope we're hopeless. And so we continue. And, but it is a shameful thing, and I worry, with our international relationships and the stresses that we're experiencing in response to America. And where we're going to sit in terms of the government's priorities, I think, is going to take a hit. And it already has, budgetarily speaking, yeah.
We were talking just before about the announcement about the pipeline in Alberta, and the fact that that's just come through as a policy decision, which is being resisted in British Columbia, but that ability to resist the survivance that you talk about, and how that is propped up against federal government changes and priorities changing, as you say, to external pressures as well. That being so then, who's the audience for this book coming through?
Everybody, right? You know, I mean, there are people who, you know, have had the benefit of an education with respect to Indigenous history and, you know, the story of Indigenous relations in Canada. But there's lots of people that are stunned by things that I talk about sometimes. You know, like starvation policies. People think, no, not in Canada, you know, true north, strong and free. But no, it's true. Sir John A. Macdonald, when they were trying to force the Indigenous people in the prairies to take treaty and to select reserve lands, they instructed the Indian agents, this is of course after they'd completely wiped out the buffalo, which was our food, clothing, and shelter. They instructed the Indian agents not to provide rations to Indigenous people until they agreed to sign treaty or to select their reserves. Ernest Hemingway is credited with writing the shortest short story on earth, and it goes like this. Baby shoes for sale, never worn. There's a whole story in there. When you open your imagination, there's a whole story there. I found the shortest one in Canada. I was doing research for my new book, which is coming out next year. And I found this in a newspaper. It was a classified ad, and it was from the North Battleford area in Saskatchewan, which is the Treaty 6 area where I'm from in Saskatchewan. And, and it went like this. Found, white horse in the place where the Indians starved to death. Okay, this happened in Canada, okay? And people don't understand how that history creates the present and sets a precedent for the future. And I encourage people through these conversations, through these essays, to reconsider what they think they know, to take responsibility for their own re-education, if you will. Because when we get there, when we get to a place of mutual understanding, then we can get to a place of reconciliation. Yeah.
There is this real sense in the book of history as continuum, as history is contemporary as well, and actually that goal of going, look, it is 10 years down the line, but the colonial systems are still in place in terms of the justice system, which I know you've been doing a lot of work in. There was something, I mean, this is, as I say, an uncompromising book and has a lot of horror within it. I will say it is also incredibly salty, and I adore that. My favorite line in the whole book is, perhaps this is why the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, did not create a list of things to think about and discuss earnestly over tea at the book club. Which is, I laughed at it. I think, yeah.
Let me give you the context about that, okay? Is that on the government website, they refer to the calls to action as recommendations. These were not recommendations. These were the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was commissioned to say, this is what you need to do. This is what needs to happen. But when you define it as a recommendation, then it becomes easy to reject. Okay, so they didn't, as I say here, they didn't say, please think about it, and if you feel like it, maybe do this. They didn't do that. They said, this is what must occur. I'd forgotten I'd said that. But I like it, and I'm glad I did.
I think we should get it on T-shirts, to be honest.
I think so, too. Yeah. Good idea, yeah.
But so, I mean, so there is this frustration around the change and the resilience that can come through that. I was thinking about this book, and specifically your background as a lawyer as well, and the fact that, you know, this book is for non-Indigenous audiences. You have a fabulous chapter in this looking at, you know, Indigenous storytelling and the traditions and the context, and how there's a reference to when the oral tradition was accepted as a source of knowledge in the courts. Can you talk a little bit to that?
Sure. This was I don't know that many people are familiar with the Supreme Court of Canada case in Delgamuukw. This was a case where Aboriginal rights were first recognized by the Supreme Court of Canada. And they also gave a nod to the notion of Aboriginal title. But before that case went to the Supreme Court of Canada, it was in the Supreme Court of British Columbia and then the Appeal Court of British Columbia. And in the Supreme Court of BC, oral tradition, that is the storytelling that had come down from, you know, generation to generation to generation, was accepted as historical evidence. And so the court could give weight to it when they were rendering their decision about whether, you know, sovereignty had been surrendered or not. That was overturned at the Court of Appeal, and then it was upheld again at the Supreme Court of Canada. But the important consideration about oral history is that's not unique to Indigenous people. You know, oral tradition is, you know, we didn't always write down our histories. Any human didn't always write down their histories. We told the stories from generation to generation. And I remember once having a big argument when I was working for the Department of Justice. Didn't last there long. And, you know, that oral history, Indigenous storytelling is not like Winnie the Pooh, okay? It's, you know, it's an incredibly well-maintained social institution for passing down the knowledge from time immemorial to now and into the future. And this is the argument that the courts accepted and why they would give weight to oral history as evidence. But, you know, I think about some of the monsters in Canadian history, like Duncan Campbell Scott. I'm going to tell you something about Duncan Campbell Scott. He was the Superintendent of Indian Affairs right around the early 1900s. And at that time, Indigenous families were raising grave concerns about the number of children who were becoming ill and dying in residential schools. And so he sent his chief medical officer, Dr. Peter Bryce, my hero, to do a conditions report in a selection of residential schools. Well, he came back and he wrote his report, and in it he said, "The children are dying like flies. We do not see this rate of death even in war." And he subsequently said that if we had intended to set up institutions for the successful transference of tuberculosis, we've done it with the residential schools. Duncan Campbell Scott responded by saying, "While it is true that the children die at a much faster rate than they do in their villages, this is not sufficient for us to basically to stop doing what we're doing, because our objective is to reach a final solution." Final solution. That term didn't originate in World War II in Germany. It originated here before the Second World War. And so, you know, we need to understand that, you know, we have figures in history that were determined to end us. And when we talk about this in the context of oral history, what did the children of those figures in history hear at the knees of their parents? My grandmother was non-Indigenous, and she was the hugest racist on earth. She had a fit when my father decided he was going to marry a Cree woman. She almost lost her mind. And but it's what she grew up with. I asked myself in one of the essays in the book, was she a monster? No. She was a prairie woman of her day. And it's because of that oral tradition. It's what children learn in their house, listening to their mothers and fathers and aunties and uncles and grandparents. And it's something we must accept responsibility for going forward, that the stories we tell, that our oral tradition changes as it must.
There's a line in the book that really runs through it, which is truth is more than fact. And this idea that it is, you know, it's a learned behavior as well. I'm just thinking of, you know, other sort of, other books by Indigenous writers which have, you know, been published and the work has gone into it really for the to educate the non-Indigenous audience. It's stepping into the Western tradition. I'm thinking of Valley of the Bird Tale by Andrew Stobo Snyderman and Douglas Sanderson, which is very good on Duncan Campbell Scott and tracing through all that in the prairies. Also Lee Marical's My Conversations with Canadians, also setting out the terms for genocide very clearly and reading them through. And so this feels like, you know, the books are coming, the information is there, the education is there. For you to, but it's not within necessarily the Indigenous way of transmission of knowledge. It's stepping into the Western canon, the Western tradition.
Well, yes and no. Yes and no. And you also have to accept that culture is a living thing. It's a thing that changes and grows. The culture that we were practicing, in the 1800s was traditional and something, that carried all of our history from the beginning of time, but it also adapted according to new inventions, new understandings, new concepts, right? But what I will say, and I believe it because I think it's true with my novel, Five Little Indians, is the way we tell stories is different. It's very different, and it's very consistent with our traditional storytelling methods and structure, right? So long as that we're not all brainwashed by the, creative writing courses that say it must be this and it must be that. As an example, I constantly get grief about the fact in Five Little Indians, well, maybe not grief, but people ask questions about it. I switch from first person or switch into first person in a couple of places, but I did it with intention. I didn't slip, right? One of them is when one of the characters, for those of you who haven't read it, sorry, spoiler, one of the characters dies, but we're in that spirit's consciousness. We're in that man's consciousness after he dies. And so it had to be in the first person, because who else would know what was happening to him but him? And so, and also the braided narrative structure that I chose for Five Little Indians was much more circular than the sort of linear beginning, middle, end, right? And, and I think you'll see that in a lot of Indigenous writers' work. Louise Erdrich is a perfect example, my queen, of the braided narrative approach to writing. And it just gives you a much deeper experience, I think, as a reader. Yeah. I
know the moment you're talking about in Five Little Indians as well, and it's a beautiful shift because as a reader you go, wait, something shifted.
And that is what I intended.
Yeah.
How else?
And you have to figure out what's happened.
Like without saying, okay, he died, how else do I make that transition from, he's in this world and now he's in that world, right? So that was my intention, was to make the reader go, wait a minute. So,
yeah, and it's a jolt, but it's gentle as well, because actually what he's experiencing in that moment is so beautiful. Finally, for that character as well.
That poor guy.
You did your master's with Katarina Vermette, is that right?
Well, we were in the master's program at UBC at the same time.
At the same time, yeah.
And we also, this is very interesting, but we won't necessarily. Well, it might be a segue into another conversation, but we were in Joseph Boyden's workshop. And Joseph...
That's who she doesn't name in that interview. Okay.
And he was my thesis supervisor. That was an experience, let me tell you. So that may segue into somewhere else that you'd like to go.
Go segue. Because I'd listened to an interview with Katarina, and she talked about the experience of going into that writing world. And so let's talk about come around to Five Little Indians and writing practice, and that you came to it a lot later. You had this grounding in community work. You'd worked for years with survivors of residential schools. Talk about that shift to storytelling and where that came, and where did that ground you?
It wasn't a shift. People ask me that all the time, because I started at 18 as an activist, and then at 40 I went to law school, and at 64 I had my first book published. I'm so old, but to me it's not a shift. And people say, how did you make that transition, and blah blah. I'm doing the same work. I'm just doing it in a different way, and it's just about approach. And I'm just yeah, I'm doing the same work. I'm trying to change the world. I did it with activism, I did it with law, now I'm doing it with my writing. Yeah.
I love that there's a continuation with it. And with that, in the book, you have a chapter on what you call cultural pillaging, which is uncompromising in your criticism of writers whose Indigenous roots have been revealed to be less than true. Can you speak to that?
Less than true. Fraudulent. Never wants to mince words. Yeah, the problem with pretendians, this is a terrible plague on our nations. It's a terrible thing where people, and I'll just go back to UBC and Joseph Boyden. The first time I sat down in a workshop with him, I thought to myself, what's wrong with this guy? Something's not right. And I remember telling a friend of mine, I don't think he's Indigenous. And my friend said, oh, Michelle. But then when the truth came out, they were like, oh, Michelle. So, but
can I ask, was it a feeling? Could you, why, where did that reaction come from?
It was a feeling. I think it was my intuition, my God place, you know, my spiritual response to him. And also the way he spoke and wrote, that I thought was a couple of things. One, anybody that has read 3 Day Road, don't read it. If you haven't read it, don't read it. But there's a scene in 3 Day Road where the grandmother character is remembering being at residential school and how she sneaks down in the middle of the night and cuts her own hair to avoid them cutting her hair. Well, no Indigenous person would cut their own hair, not in a million years. So it was those kinds of, you know, inconsistencies and inaccuracies in his writing that led me to question. But one day we were sitting and talking, because we were talking about whether he would be my supervisor, and he said to me, okay, I was 50-something at the time, and he said to me, you're going to be a good elder. And then he said, I'm not saying you're an elder now, okay, but you're going to be a good elder. And by saying that, I'm not saying you're an elder now, he was saying to me, I'm not saying you're old. Okay, well, you don't seem to understand that there is reverence for age in our culture. And that was another clue to me. And I would never call myself an elder. I call myself an older, but not an elder, right? Because an elder assumes certain knowledge that through, you know, my apprehension as a child and placement in the foster system, I don't have. And so I would never consider myself an elder, never. You know, no matter, you know, what insights I may be able to offer, there are things that I will never have. That limit my identity in that sense, so yeah. But, so pretendianism. Largely, you know, this is not a new phenomenon, and what's interesting is that it's becoming generational, okay? Joseph Boyden's uncle, okay, Earl, his uncle Earl, was a pretendian, okay? He used to set himself up in Manitoulin Island Park there and sell tacky tourist things, okay? And he referred to himself as Injun Joe, okay? And that was who Joseph originally attributed his indigeneity to, was this guy. And there was an article it was Maclean's, interestingly, that wrote an article about Injun Joe that said Injun Joe admits he's not an Injun, right? And so, you know, but this is still what Joseph, you know, based his heritage on. And, you know, I know from, you know, intimate knowledge about Joseph from somebody that would know that, you know, his writing was going nowhere, absolutely nowhere, until he started writing about as though he were Indigenous. And he had a conversation with his then wife, and she was saying, well, are you, right? He says, I don't know, maybe, don't know. But then his work became very profitable. It became something that people wanted to buy, and so of course he bought into it and profited mightily from it, and went around the countryside claiming to be Métis, Mi'kmaq, Nipmuc, Ojibwe, blah 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 blah. At one point was speaking to a woman from an indigenous community, and she asked him, well, where are you from? And he said, I'm from this community. It was her community, right? She said, right? Went back and spoke to her elders, and they said no, right? And and then just refusing. And this is I'm working on a collection right now. I'm editing a collection that's going to come out in 2027. It's called The Pretendian Compendium, The Strange Phenomenon of Indigenous Identity Fraud. And I've got some of the leading experts on the subject that are each contributing a chapter to the book. And one of the things that, I'm going to speak about two things here. One of the things is that there is a predictable response when Indigenous or non-Indigenous people are outed as pretendians. First, they double down. And they say, no, I know who I am. You can't tell me who I am. I know who I am. I'm this and I'm that, and I suffered this, and poor me, and blah, blah, okay? And then, they play victim, they do that whole thing, and then they just quietly disappear. The other thing that one of the chapters in this book is being written by a psychologist. She's written it already, and it's so good. And in psychology, in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, there are diagnoses that of psychopathy, narcissism, and there's reference, it's not a diagnosis, but reference to Machiavellian behavior. And in recent years, psychologists are putting those together in what they call, it's like science fiction, in what they call the dark triad, okay? And what they refer to as the dark triad is aspects of psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. And this is what this psychologist says is the nature of a pretendian. They don't care about the harm they're causing. They're only completely self-interested, and such is the case. And so, that I'm really looking forward to the completion of that book and hoping that it'll give people the opportunity to learn more about it and to understand why it's so dangerous. Because it's occurring not just on an individual basis. There are whole groups of people in Ontario, there are groups of people that are incorporating themselves under provincial legislation as societies and naming themselves the such and such Indian band, okay? Then they're going to court and they're trying to get recognized under the Indian Act as an Indian band so that they can, take part in, the benefits of treaty settlements, of, court decisions on settlements. The women largely appear in academia. They're looking at the benefits they get from pretending to be Indigenous by teaching in academia. Men are very interested, I know it sort of seems like arbitrary, but the evidence holds up, in having hunting, fishing, economic rights. So, no.
We knew this was going to happen. We're taking responsibility for this. It's okay. There's an example you cite in the book as well. I think it's one of the leaders of the Freedom Convoy or something who cites himself as being Métis, while also advocating for white supremacy outside Parliament. I mean,
I know, it's ridiculous. Yeah.
Is there space for people to truly not know?
Yeah, well, and this is one of the complexities of pretendianism, is that because of the residential school system and because of, the apprehension of the, so many Indigenous children, taking them away from their homes and families and so on, there are people, like from my band, we had a person that was taken all the way to Scotland. Okay, how are they supposed to know where they're from, who their people are, but they know they're Indigenous? Okay, and so this is where it becomes very, very sensitive, because we need to stop accepting only self-identification, where people say, like Thomas King. And, you know, we really do need to stop that. But at the same time, we need to have room for people. Like, it could have easily been me. If my mother had not, when we were very young children, you know, told us a lot about our Indigenous background, if we had not spent a lot of time on the reserve, I might have been one of those people that didn't know, well, knew I was Indigenous, but couldn't point out to where I came from. And so it's very sensitive, and we need to find ways to protect ourselves from these rapacious pretendians who are just, you know, like Robert. Thomas King has benefited his entire life. He's a rich man on the back of a lie. And, you know, if you've read his Globe and Mail editorial where he, you know, proposes to fall on his sword, it's, I was going to say a word that started with B, it's a lie, okay? You know, he says, oh, I heard these rumors and so I went and I did research and blah, blah. No, no. People confronted him for decades saying, are you? Can you demonstrate? And he just ignored people because it wasn't in his interests to actually, you know, come forward and say, And then ultimately he did do some, well, not ultimately, ultimately, he did some research and couldn't confirm one way or another. If we are to believe that he was genuine in belief and intent, he would have come forward at that time and said, you know, I'm not sure. I can't confirm that I am. But he chose not to because there was big money in it and ego. So anyway.
No, thank you for your candor, and as I say, not mincing words, as you said earlier on it. And yeah, I think the compendium, we haven't heard the last from yourself on this, I think as well, but yeah, thank you for the subtlety. Look at the pleading eyes over here.
I came across the country. I came all the way from Saskatchewan for 45 minutes.
Do you want to take questions, or would you go straight to the reading? I will say that Michelle will be back in conversation with Julie Pellissier-Lush, I think, tomorrow with Vanessa Bell, so come and hear more. Come and hear more. I think now we'll finish with the reading. Yeah, we're going to finish with the reading.
And then, if you want to come over to where am I going to be?
You're going to be in the Moran Centre next door.
Come and talk to me over there. We can ask questions and whatever. But I've finished a new novel. It's in production. It's called Eliza Sunshine. It'll come out in August. And I'd like to just read you the first couple of paragraphs from that. It's a novel in 3 parts. The first part is based on the life of my great-grandmother, who was born in 1856. I was born in 1956, and I'm old. Okay. So the first part is called Swan, and it starts with an inscription. Let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo are exterminated. Then your prairies can be covered with speckled cattle and festive cowboys. Every dead buffalo is an Indian gone. General Philip Sheridan. I'll tell you, this is the first time I'm reading from the novel. Okay. I was born at the beginning of the end. I was given the name Swan. It was not, though, for the power and grace of that bird that I became its namesake. I was given this name for the drive in me to see and understand everything. My father, Musqua, sometimes called me Longneck, teasing me about my need to have my beak in every conversation. Remembering the mirth in his voice makes me smile even now. Back then, it assured me of his affection. His teasing was tender, not barbed or scolding. An old woman now, no longer an oblivious child, I look back, realizing what I didn't know, that the end of our days of freedom and plenty was a bitter wind, touching everything, even then. I see my parents' and grandparents' faces as I knew them as a child, so filled with love and confidence. But the truth of that end is also etched on their faces. I see the burden of worry in their eyes. I feel the tension in their embraces. I was born in freedom and couldn't possibly have understood that my childhood world and everything we knew and treasured would crumble around us like a riverbank in a flood. It was something beyond even imagination. I try not to think of those bitter times. I remember with my eyes. I see all the destruction and suffering as though it was happening again, And those awful sights create a wave of pain so strong, I feel it in my body and cry out to the ones taken from me for mercy and forgetting. And now Eliza has come home from that school today, and I hardly know her. She is thin, starvation on her like a dark cloud. Her beautiful hair, touching the backs of her knees when she left, is cropped rough and short and no longer shines. Her eyes, those bright, curious eyes, are dull and listless. I recognize the pain in them. It is my pain and the pain I've seen again and again in the ones I love. Too much for a little girl. I told her mother, Sarah, she is to stay with me in my tent until she is taken back. I will take her out gathering with me like we did before, and the prairie will remind her of herself. She doesn't know of the great suffering. How could she, and why should she have to? But I will tell her. That way she can carry it back with her to that place, knowing that through it all, I did not surrender, and neither must she.
Ladies and gentlemen, Michelle Good. We will be going across to the Moran Centre, so please, as ever, if you could not stop Michelle on the way out. It's so cruel to say, but basically come and see her in the signing tent. I think I'll be there as well.
And thank you for joining me today. I appreciate it.